When culture functions as a capability, the gap between the paper story and the operational story narrows. Evidence stops accumulating after the fact and starts appearing naturally as the boundary runs. At that point, disciplined improvement, structured experiments, and systematic learning stop being ideas borrowed from somewhere else. They become the natural extension of what a strong team already does on its best days, applied deliberately to every boundary rather than left to chance. That extension still needs a capability built to carry it. Assure can confirm that a control is working. Govern can confirm that a policy is followed. Neither capability is built to ask whether the control or the policy is still solving the right problem. This chapter turns to the capability that asks that question directly. Innovate is not a license for disruption. It is the mechanism that tells an organization when a pattern still fits and when it needs to change. Innovate is the capability most often confused with disruption for its own sake. That confusion causes real damage because organizations either avoid systemic change out of fear of losing control or attempt it without a governing mechanism and produce chaos instead of progress. Both mistakes come from treating innovation as an event rather than as a capability with its own discipline. This chapter builds that discipline in 3 parts. It defines 4 depths of intervention Innovate can apply, from tuning a parameter to replacing a paradigm. It explains how a single policy change cascades automatically through everything built on top of it. Then it introduces FastTrack sequencing, the mechanism that determines when an organization is ready to attempt each depth safely. The meridian settlement boundary continues as the working example. Watching one boundary move through each phase shows how the same mechanism scales from a single tuning adjustment to a complete change in how the organization protects and delivers value, without the two ever being confused for each other. Most managers working to improve resilience are not short on ideas. They can describe the desired future state in detail, and they understand exactly where the current state falls short of it. The gap between the two is rarely a gap in intention. What is missing is a reliable mechanism for moving from recognizing a systemic problem to changing how the system actually operates. Without that mechanism, an organization does not have one path forward. It has 2 failure modes, and both are more damaging than doing nothing. Over-engineering the change wastes effort by building process for a problem that did not require it. A team spends months designing a new escalation structure to solve what was actually a training gap, and the underlying behavior never changes because the mechanism aimed at the wrong layer. The organization ends up with more process and the same failure rate it started with. Triggering system chaos does the opposite. It forces a change onto a system before anyone has mapped what that change will disrupt, and the boundary destabilizes in places no one was watching, often the places furthest from where the change was originally aimed. Both failures share the same root cause. Attempting systemic change without a governing mechanism forces a binary choice between administrative gridlock, where nothing moves because no one will commit to an untested change, and operational chaos, where everything moves at once because nothing is sequenced. The rest of this chapter builds that governing mechanism piece by piece. Innovate is not a license to pursue disruption for its own sake, or to generate new features because change feels productive. Confusing motion with progress is one of the more common failures in a maturing system, and it is expensive precisely because it looks like effort. Innovate is the capability that changes how an organization creates, protects, and delivers value, not merely what it delivers. That distinction matters because most capabilities operate within the system as it currently exists. Execute delivers work inside a defined process. Assure checks that the process performs as designed. Both are essential, and neither is built to question whether the process itself is still the right one. When a problem lives at the structural level, working within those boundaries is no longer sufficient. A team can tune a threshold, retrain staff, and rewrite a runbook, and still be optimizing a process that no longer matches the risk it was built to manage. The organization has to operate on the system itself, examining the boundary rather than just the activity inside it. That shift from within the system to on the system is what separates standard delivery of value from genuine innovation. It also explains why Innovate cannot be delegated entirely to the team executing daily work. Someone has to be positioned to see the boundary as a whole, not just the task directly in front of them. Change and Innovate ask different questions, and confusing them leads an organization to apply the wrong kind of effort to the wrong kind of problem. Change asks whether the organization can reach a destination it already knows is correct. It operates at the level of parameters and rules, the settings and procedures that make a system run, improving and traveling an existing path. Success means arriving at the intended state, and the work produces diminishing returns as that path matures. Adding another layer of approval to a workflow is change. It can make the workflow safer, but it cannot tell the organization whether the workflow is solving the right problem. Innovate asks a harder question. Is the destination still the right one? It operates at the level of feedback loops, rules, and paradigms, the deeper layers that determine what the system pays attention to and how it interprets what it sees. That reach means Innovate can question a path that change would only continue to refine. Its outcomes are discovered and emergent, surfacing performance gaps the organization did not know to look for, then testing new patterns and retiring approaches that no longer serve the current state. At Meridian, Change tightened the approval workflow around a known settlement risk for 2 years running. Innovate was the capability that eventually asked whether the settlement model itself, not the approval workflow, was the actual constraint. Both capabilities are necessary. The failure comes from applying change discipline to a problem that requires Innovate or the reverse. Innovate operates at 4 depths, and diagnosing the correct depth is the difference between solving a problem and creating the illusion of solving one. Incremental sits at the surface. It makes small continuous adjustments, such as tuning an exception threshold during a high-volume period, moving a system from one minor version to the next without altering how it is built. The change is visible almost immediately, and the risk of getting it wrong is low. Sustaining sits just below the surface. It adds new capability without changing the underlying structure, introducing a new fail-safe pattern to handle counterparty delays, for example, rather than redesigning the boundary that handles them. The system does more than it did before, but it still does it the same way. Adaptive reaches deeper still. It alters policy itself, changing the rule under which a boundary operates, such as revising who has the authority to approve a settlement override. This depth changes behavior across the boundary immediately, because policy is what everything downstream refers back to. Disruptive reaches the core. It represents a strategic paradigm shift, adopting an entirely new settlement model that changes the fundamental nature of the reconciliation boundary, rather than adjusting how that boundary behaves. Almost nothing built on the old model survives the transition unchanged. Diagnosis fails in both directions, and neither failure is obvious right away. Applying disruptive optimization to a parameter-level problem destabilizes a boundary that only needed a small adjustment, replacing something that worked with something untested, and the organization absorbs that cost without ever solving the original problem. Applying incremental optimization to a paradigm-level problem does not fail loudly either. It creates an illusion of progress while the actual structural gap remains untouched, and the organization can spend years tuning parameters around a paradigm that no longer fits, mistaking motion for correction. Correct diagnosis is the first and most important step in this chapter, because every mechanism that follows assumes the depth has already been identified correctly. A policy revision does not stay contained at the level where it was made. Change a rule at the top of a governance structure, and the structure beneath it reorganizes automatically to reflect that rule, whether anyone intends for it to or not. This reorganization is not a side effect the organization has to manage manually. The system self-organizes around the revised rule, because every downstream outcome that depended on the old rule now depends on the new one instead. A design runbook written against the old authorization limit is no longer accurate the moment the limit changes, regardless of when someone gets around to editing the document. That mechanism explains why a single adaptive change, revising who can authorize an exception, can produce effects across an entire tree of outcomes without anyone editing those outcomes directly. It also explains why the wave of downstream work that follows a policy revision is not a problem to be managed. It is the system working as intended, and Innovate is the capability that makes that wave visible and sequences it, rather than letting it surface as a string of unrelated surprises. The outcome measure tree an organization uses to track performance is not an independent structure standing apart from policy. It is a downstream expression of that policy, an outcome paired with the measure that proves it is happening, which means changing the policy changes the tree beneath it automatically. At Meridian, the exception authorization policy shifted to pre-authorized senior operators for a defined class of transactions. That single adaptive change rewired the root outcome the tree was built to track, because the behavior the tree measured had itself changed. The outcome was no longer whether every exception reached a full review. It became whether the pre-authorized class of exceptions still behaved within safe limits. The practical implication is significant, and it changes how a manager should respond to a policy revision. The tree does not require editing metric by metric, chasing each branch that drifted out of alignment. It updates when the organization edits the policy that generated those metrics in the first place, and every design runbook, escalation path, and execution training tied to that policy updates with it, in the same motion. Editing metrics directly, without touching the policy behind them, treats the symptom and leaves the cause in place. The tree will drift again. The 4 depths describe what kind of change is involved. They do not describe when it is safe to attempt that change, and timing matters just as much as diagnosis. An organization can correctly identify that a problem is adaptive and still cause damage by attempting the change at the wrong moment. Attempting an adaptive or disruptive change before an organization has established basic parameter hygiene does not produce chaos because the change itself was wrong. It produces chaos because reliable feedback loops do not yet exist to tell the organization whether the change is working. A boundary that cannot yet detect its own incremental drift has no way to detect whether a policy revision improved or worsened its behavior. FastTrack is the sequencing discipline that closes this gap. It draws on the scientific method and on the plan-do study adjust cycle developed by Deming to determine when an organization is ready to move from tuning parameters to questioning paradigms. The perimeter it establishes is not a restriction on innovation. It is what makes innovation survivable, so that change proceeds from a defensible perimeter rather than from disruption without stability. FastTrack sequences readiness through 4 phases, and each phase describes where the organizational center of gravity currently sits, not an arbitrary checkpoint on a project plan. Phase 0 is bedrock. The organization gets the basics right, establishing a foundation beyond the layer of chaos so that consistency becomes possible at all. An organization at bedrock has not yet earned the right to ask whether its approach is correct, because it cannot yet reliably tell what its approach actually is. Phase 1 is first wall. Sustainable innovation becomes the primary focus, and the organization applies adaptive changes consistently rather than sporadically. This is where most boundaries live longer than expected, because consistency at this level takes real discipline to sustain. Phase 2 is expanding floor. The operating perimeter expands fully, adaptive change becomes normalized rather than exceptional, and the organization becomes ready to consider disruptive shifts. Feedback loops that were fragile at Phase 1 are now reliable enough to trust with a bigger question, and the organization can tell the difference between a genuine signal and ordinary noise. Phase 3 is active structure. Innovation continues from a stable core, and the organization can confidently pursue disruptive paradigm shifts because the foundation beneath them can absorb the change rather than being destabilized by it. A boundary at this phase can retire an entire model and keep operating through the transition. Each phase has to be earned. Skipping ahead does not accelerate maturity. It removes the stability that makes the next phase survivable, which is why FastTrack treats sequencing as a discipline rather than a formality, and why a phase cannot be assigned on paper without evidence that the boundary actually behaves that way. Every depth of intervention is matched to a phase of stability, and applying the wrong depth to the wrong phase is the primary source of governance initiative fatigue, the exhaustion that sets in when an organization keeps launching change efforts that never quite take hold. A boundary that struggles with basic consistency needs Phase 1 stabilization, not a disruptive paradigm shift. Attempting the paradigm shift first does not skip the stabilization work. It simply guarantees the shift fails for reasons that have nothing to do with whether the new paradigm was correct, and the organization walks away believing the idea itself was the problem. The matrix works in the other direction as well. A boundary that has already reached active structure gains little from another round of incremental tuning, because the returns on that depth of intervention have already diminished for that boundary. Continuing to apply it anyway consumes attention that a genuine paradigm-level opportunity could have used instead. Matching depth to phase is what keeps innovation productive instead of exhausting, and it is why FastTrack treats the matrix as a constraint on intervention, not a menu of options to choose from freely. None of these mechanisms operate as a standalone activity. Innovate sits inside a continuous loop with the other minimum viable capabilities, and the loop is what makes learning systemic rather than occasional. Innovate analyzes the limits of the current system and designs thin-slice experiments to test a hypothesis inside normal workflow, rather than as a separate initiative that pulls people away from their actual jobs. Design and change carry that hypothesis forward into a concrete revision. Execute tests it under real operating conditions, in the flow of ordinary work rather than in a lab. Assure monitors the result and feeds evidence upward, surfacing drift and incidents rather than waiting for a scheduled review to catch what already happened. Govern uses that evidence to retest the underlying policy, closing the loop back to Innovate, which identifies the next gap for the other capabilities to address. No single capability in that loop can see the whole picture on its own, which is precisely why the loop has to run continuously rather than as a handoff between departments. This is what distinguishes a system that learns from a team that occasionally improves something. The loop runs continuously, not in response to a crisis, and every capability in it depends on the others completing their part for the loop to hold together. Break any one link and the organization is back to isolated learning events, rather than a verified learning system. The meridian settlement boundary shows what these four depths look like when they operate together rather than in sequence, which is the condition every mature boundary eventually reaches. At the incremental level, operators continuously tune alert sensitivities and threshold volumes based on their own feedback, a small adjustment running on a near-continuous cycle that never fully stops. At the sustaining level, the organization deploys a new monitoring integration on a monthly cadence, adding early warning capacity for volume spikes without altering the underlying structure of the boundary. At the adaptive level, a cascade is already active on a quarterly cycle. The outcome measure data proved a bottleneck in exception authorization. The policy was revised to pre-authorize senior operators, and runbooks are updating to reflect the change, following exactly the mechanism this chapter described earlier. At the disruptive level, the organization is evaluating an entirely new settlement model on an annual horizon, built on 3 years of AI-assisted behavior data, with Phase 1 and 2 stability already confirmed before the evaluation was allowed to begin. Nothing about that evaluation started early. It became possible only after the boundary earned the right to ask the question. All four depths are visible at the same time, running at different timescales and system levels, and FastTrack sequencing is what keeps that simultaneous activity coherent, rather than chaotic. A manager who applies these sequences consistently is not running a collection of isolated techniques. Each depth of intervention, each phase of readiness, and each turn of the loop only produces its full value in relation to the others. What that manager is actually running is an active learning system. It generates evidence, acts on that evidence, tests the result, and adjusts the sequence based on what the test shows, continuously rather than as a periodic event bolted onto the calendar. The distinction is not cosmetic. A collection of techniques degrades the moment the person who understood them moves to another role. A learning system persists because the mechanism, not any individual, carries the discipline forward, at the pace the boundary actually moves rather than the pace of whoever remembers to check. That continuous cycle marks the definitive transition this chapter has been building toward. An organization that once governed by static documentation now governs by empirical assurance instead.